on Friday, November 7th, we are hosting a very fun, I think, hopefully, symposium that we've titled Textual Intimacies. And this was inspired by Spivak's idea of translation. She states at one point that translation is the most intimate form of reading. And when I read that, I thought, I mean, yes, it's a very intimate form of reading, but I think that there are many ways to read intimately, right? And the first thing that came to mind for me was performing. When you perform a text, you have to read it so intimately that it goes in your body, right? So I thought we could expand this idea and think, how does one text prompt us to engage intimately in different ways?
Translation is a kind of utopian process that we think that we can take something that's been created in one language context, in one cultural context, in one political context, and somehow transfer it to another. And it never quite works, but it's always a valuable exercise. We're always up against that failure.
Of translation as a kind of process of negotiations of difference, right? So you're trying to refer to something else. You're trying to make you're making a transference from one thing to another thing, and in that transference there's all this negotiating difference, right? Of the things that aren't overlapping, of the things that are different in the two systems that you're working with. And they can be language, they can be two moments in time, they can be two bodies, they can be all kinds of things, but there's always a reference, and there's always a negotiation of that, because it's a type of, you're paraphrasing all the time, right? That's what you're doing, and when you're doing that, you're trying to find the gaps and negotiate them in this new space. I think of translation as something that is always active. I don't think of a translated text as something that is fixed, because I think that negotiation of the differences is always sort of in continuation.
It's quite an amazing play. I mean, I think it's one of the major dramatic achievements of the mid-20th century in European theater, because it broke down, and together with other plays by Ionesco and Beckett and so on, it really kind of broke down a lot of the conventions of the bourgeois theater at that time period. And from a technical point of view and a storytelling point of view, just opened so many doors. It's also, I think, a really brave work of theater politically, and its kind of initial anti-fascist orientation marked it out as that. And I think it's endured because people recognize it as that kind of singular work of theater that pushes the boundaries both aesthetically and politically. And that's what makes it interesting to come back to.
It's not an easy text to produce, but it kind of follows a structure and a logic that we're intuitively used to, but then it's like off, right? So it has that very firm structure, and at the same time it's challenging it all the time. So this is a very important step that Ionesco takes in how he questions language and our use of language. For students, it's huge to understand that, and for actors in general to train that way of working with a text. And it makes it very interesting too when you're talking about a translated text, because it means that there's a lot in the action, right? And then then you have the question of, okay, you're translating from French to English, and that's sort of one layer of the translation, but is the action itself also translated differently? And what does that mean?
And what Krim's translation does is open up, I think, a lot of new possibilities in terms of thinking about this play in the present moment. It's also relevant for me personally and for other people who work on animals and performance, the idea of animality in performance, because there's been a whole, it's sort of been taken for granted that there's centuries of dramatic literature and other forms of art making that have put the animal front and center, but we haven't adequately thought through what that means and what that entails. So with the kind of burgeoning of scholarship on animal studies and animals in theater, animals in literature, I think we have a really great opportunity to come back to some of these classic texts and say, well, what if we took the animal more seriously? What if we took the animal, the process of involving an animal in performance more seriously, and see what that did to these classic texts. The rhinoceroses in the piece are a challenge from a number of perspectives. I think that if you want to take them seriously, instead of just being a metaphor for, say, fascism, in which case the kind of meaning, meaning that the rhinoceroses have been assigned is sort of always already known and kind of foreclosed in that way. And we wanted to explode that process a little bit and say, well, what if we think about the rhinoceroses as rhinoceroses? And there's a line in the play where one of the characters says, the rhinoceroses exist, they mean what they mean. And we take that as kind of a provocation or an opening of possibility to say, what if they mean what they mean, instead of necessarily meaning fascism or necessarily meaning Nazism or what have you. Then, of course, you run into an obstacle because you can't actually have real living rhinoceroses on stage. They have to be performed or operated in some way by human actors. And so we decided to take that kind of second limitation as an opportunity as well and say, all right, let's make our rhinoceroses kind of assemblages of the detritus of the set and of the imagined environment, and then we can focus on the actual process of transformation of a human being into a rhinoceros and the kind of metaphorical work that happens when you want to make an animal mean something. How do you kind of assemble an animal abstraction out of human life and human politics? And that became our goal for the production.
I learned a lot about animals. I think that has been probably the most exciting thing for me. Not really thinking a lot about that before. I think this has been a great opportunity to learn along with the actors and with the creative team about how to practically and conceptually work around issues of animality and of animals.
The most interesting thing has been the research on actual rhinos and actual rhino behavior that we've done to try and give these animals, or these representation of animals, a kind of life on stage. And one of the things that I think people will hear and maybe be surprised by when they come to see the show is the sounds that the performers are making, which are based on actual rhinoceros sounds and quite extraordinary in many ways.
They really like connecting in like this area. So when they have these like huge bodies and they're always like cheek to cheek. They're always like finding each other in these like points and moments, and I think that, I don't know, I always thought of rhinos as very solitary, and I really like that picture of almost like them creating these hearts, these, I don't know, they find each other in these diagonals that I find very intimate, and I like.
Friday, November 14th is an exciting day because we're opening the show on that day, and then in advance of the opening we're having an afternoon conversation at 3 p.m. where we've invited a number of artists and scholars and scholar artists to talk about how animals feature in art making. So we've invited a number of people from Stanford who are going to talk about their research, academic research on this topic, and there are a number of artists who are also going to talk about this from a variety of disciplinary perspectives. So we're hoping to get a kind of robust conversation going about how the animal enters in so many different ways into art practice, and then what that means from an academic theoretical perspective.